Somewhere on the frozen steppe south of Stalingrad, German tank crews scan the night sky. Flares arc upward in the distance, red and white burning against black. The encircled 6th Army is marking its position, 48 kilometers. In any other context, a trivial distance. An hour on a highway, an afternoon's march. But in December 1942, on this steppe, that number has stopped being geography. It has become logistics. Inside the pocket, a field report crosses Paulus's desk. The fuel reserves of the entire 6th Army, 300,000 men, thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks, have been calculated down to a single figure. 30 kilometers of movement. Not 30 kilometers per day, 30 kilometers total. The relief force needs them to cover more than triple that distance. The fuel does not exist. The tanks cannot move. The breakout cannot happen. And the reason sits in a promise made weeks earlier in a briefing room far from the snow. Reichsmarshal Hermann Goring told Hitler the Luftwaffe could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day to the encircled army. Hitler accepted this as operational fact. Every decision that followed, holding the pocket, refusing withdrawal, planning the relief, rested on that single number. The records from December 1942 tell a different story. On the best days, roughly 150 tons reached the pocket. On the worst, far less. 1/6 of what was promised. Week after week, the gap between the pledge and the reality widened. And with each passing day, the fuel burned, the ammunition shrank, and the window for escape closed a little more. Those flares in the night sky are visible. The men firing them believe rescue is coming. Those 48 kilometers will not be crossed. Pull back to late November 1942. Operation Uranus has just closed its jaws. Soviet pincers meet west of Stalingrad, and roughly 300,000 Axis personnel find themselves sealed inside a pocket. The encirclement is complete. In any military textbook, the next step is straightforward. A surrounded force either breaks out immediately while it still has strength and supplies, or it dies in place. The clock starts ticking the moment the ring closes. But for the 6th Army, the clock is overridden by a voice from Berlin. The question on the table at Fuhrer Headquarters is simple. Does the 6th Army retreat, pulling back through the narrowing corridor before it vanishes? Or does it hold position and wait for resupply by air? The answer depends entirely on one variable. Can the Luftwaffe feed an army from the sky? Göring says yes, 500 tons per day. He delivers this figure with the authority of the second highest ranking man in the Reich. The records do not show a detailed logistical analysis attached to the promise. No fleet capacity study. No weather assessment for the Russian winter. No calculation of Soviet fighter strength along the air corridors. What the records do show is what happened next. Hitler accepts the number. The withdrawal option disappears from the table. The 6th Army receives orders to hold Stalingrad at all costs. A new command, Army Group Don under Erich von Manstein, is formed on November 22nd to organize a relief effort from the outside. The entire strategic framework now rests on a single assumption. The airlift will keep the 6th Army alive and combat capable until ground forces can punch through. This assumption is the foundation. Every plan built on top of it, Wintergewitter, Donnerschlag, the relief corridor, inherits its structural flaw. The foundation is hollow. What does it take to keep 300,000 men alive in a frozen pocket? The 6th Army's supply requirements in December 1942 break into two categories that cannot be separated. Combat needs, ammunition, vehicle fuel, spare parts, and survival needs, food, medicine, heating fuel. That second category is the one the briefing rooms underestimate. At temperatures below -20 degrees Celsius, a tank engine that shuts down does not restart, not without an external heat source that does not exist inside the pocket. So engines must run continuously, burning fuel not to fight, but simply to remain functional. Thousands of wounded soldiers lie in basements and bunkers. Without heating, hypothermia kills within hours. The fuel to warm those spaces is not a comfort. It is the difference between a field hospital and a morgue. Now stack these requirements against the airlift's actual performance. Göring's promise, 500 tons daily. The reality, documented in supply logs, paints a different picture. The best days yield roughly 150 tons. But those are the best days. The average drops lower, and it drops further each week as Soviet anti-aircraft positions tighten, as weather windows shrink, as transport aircraft are shot down or grounded. Each ton that fails to arrive is not simply a shortfall on a ledger. It is a vehicle that cannot move tomorrow, a gun that falls silent next week, a wounded man whose bunker goes cold tonight. The deficit is cumulative. It does not reset. Monday's missing fuel is still missing on Tuesday, and Tuesday's shortage compounds it. 7 weeks of this arithmetic produce a result that no operational brilliance can reverse. The airlift is not failing dramatically. It is failing quietly, steadily, mathematically, and the men inside the pocket are consuming the last reserves that would make any breakout possible. The numbers are available. They sit in daily supply reports, in Luftwaffe sortie records, in the quartermaster's fuel inventories. The gap between promise and delivery is not hidden. It is documented, and it is ignored. The operational planning at Fuhrer Headquarters continues to treat Göring's 500-ton figure as a baseline reality, not as an aspiration, not as a best-case projection, as fact. This is where the investigative trail becomes difficult to follow, not because evidence is missing, but because the decision-making process defies the evidence in plain sight. Consider the contradiction. Manstein, now commanding Army Group Don, begins planning Operation Wintergewitter, a relief thrust from the south. The plan's logic depends on the 6th Army being strong enough to break out toward the relief force when it gets close enough. Donnerschlag, the breakout, requires mobile divisions with fuel, ammunition, and fighting strength. But the airlift reports arriving at the same headquarters show the pocket's reserves draining week by week. The fuel situation is not stable. It is deteriorating. The very resource the breakout plan requires is the one the airlift is failing to deliver. 2 documents sit on the same desk. One says the 6th Army will break out. The other says the 6th Army cannot move. Hitler dismisses both the retreat option and the supply reality. The records indicate he maintains a position with no connection to the logistical facts inside the pocket. The order remains: hold Stalingrad. Meanwhile, the 6th Panzer Division, fresh from France at over 80% of its authorized strength, arrives to spearhead the relief. It is the strongest unit available. On paper, the rescue force looks formidable. But a rescue requires something to rescue. And inside the pocket, the capacity for self-rescue is evaporating at a rate of several hundred missing tons per day. The warnings are not whispered. They are typed, filed, and distributed. They changed nothing. December 1942. Wintergewitter begins. The 57th Panzer Corps pushes north toward Stalingrad. The 6th Panzer Division leads the advance. Initial progress is real. Ground is taken. Soviet defensive lines are engaged and, in places, broken. But each kilometer forward costs time, fuel, and men. And the Soviets are not retreating. They are absorbing the blow, trading space for attrition, feeding fresh units into the path of the advance. By December 13th, resistance stiffens. The advance slows. The Mishkova River lies ahead, the last natural barrier before the pocket. Crossing it under fire against prepared positions, with an increasingly stretched supply line, is a different proposition than the opening thrust. Inside the pocket, the weekly supply average continues its decline. The gap between what arrives by air and what the Army consumes grows wider. Fuel reserves that were inadequate a week ago are now critical. The term reserve itself becomes misleading. There is no reserve. There is only a shrinking pool being consumed faster than it is replenished. And then, on December 16th, the strategic picture fractures entirely. Operation Little Saturn. Soviet forces launch a massive offensive against the Italian 8th Army on the German left flank, far to the northwest of the relief corridor. The Italians collapse within 2 days. The implications are immediate and existential. If Soviet forces reach Rostov-on-Don, the entire Army Group A in the Caucasus, a force larger than the 6th Army, will be cut off from its supply lines. Suddenly, the 6th Army is no longer the biggest problem on the map. Manstein faces a choice that is not really a choice. The forces earmarked for the relief must be redirected to prevent a larger catastrophe. The rescue mission is not defeated by the enemy in front of it. It is made irrelevant by the enemy behind it. This is where all the threads pull tight. The 57th Panzer Corps has pushed to within 48 kilometers of the pocket, close enough to see the flares, close enough, perhaps, for radio contact with the perimeter units. Manstein sends the request. The 6th Army must begin Donnerschlag, the breakout toward the relief force. Meet in the middle, close the gap. Paulus responds. The message is brief. The available fuel reserves permit movement of 30 kilometers total. Not 30 per division, not 30 per day. 30 kilometers for the entire Army. Then the tanks stop. The trucks stop. Everything stops. 30 kilometers is less than 1/3 of the distance to the 57th Panzer Corps. A breakout on this fuel basis does not reach the relief force. It deposits entire divisions in open steppe between 2 Soviet armies, without fuel, without supply, without shelter. The pocket does not open. It simply relocates to a worse position. This is the moment the arithmetic becomes visible. 7 weeks of airlift failure, 7 weeks of consuming reserves that were never replenished have produced a number, 30, that makes the breakout physically impossible. Göring's promise was the reason the 6th Army stayed in the pocket. The airlift's failure is the reason it cannot leave. The fuel that would have made Donnerschlag possible was never delivered. Not because of a single bad week, not because of one storm, because the entire airlift operated at a fraction of its promised capacity from the first day to the last. On December 23rd, Manstein cancels the attack. By December 24th, the 4th Panzer Army withdraws to its starting positions. The flares in the night sky still burn, but there is no one coming. What remains after the relief fails is not a siege. It is a countdown. The 6th Army holds its positions because it has been ordered to hold. The airlift continues because canceling it would mean acknowledging what the supply logs already confirm. But the trajectory is fixed. The pocket contracts. Soviet pressure compresses the perimeter. Each lost airfield shortens the list of usable landing strips. Each shortened strip reduces the tonnage that can be delivered. The airlift, already operating far below its promised capacity, enters a terminal decline. Rations are cut, then cut again. The caloric intake of the average soldier drops below what the body requires to function in extreme cold. Frostbite casualties mount alongside combat casualties. The distinction between wounded and sick blurs into a single category: men who cannot fight. Ammunition expenditure is rationed to a level that prevents effective defense. units report firing only when directly assaulted. The concept of a defensive line becomes theoretical, a mark on a map that corresponds to clusters of men in frozen positions, conserving rounds they cannot replace. The machinery of a modern army, the engines, the radios, the medical equipment, requires a constant flow of fuel, batteries, and parts. That flow has been a trickle for weeks. Now it approaches zero. And still, no withdrawal order comes. The position that was held because the airlift would sustain it is now held for no stated operational reason. The assumption has collapsed. The order remains. The Sixth Army does not fall in a single dramatic moment. It is subtracted from the German order of battle 1 ton at a time across 7 weeks by the distance between a promise and a fact. Strip away the narrative. Examine the mechanism. Göring's promise of 500 tons per day was accepted by Hitler as an operational planning basis. This is documented. It was not treated as an estimate or a goal. It was treated as a given, the fixed variable upon which all subsequent calculations were built. The decision to hold Stalingrad rather than authorize an immediate breakout rests on this variable. If the airlift works, the Sixth Army can maintain combat strength indefinitely. If it maintains combat strength, a relief operation has something to link up with. If the relief links up, the position is restored. Every if in that chain depends on the first one, and the first one was false from day one. The source material states it directly. Göring's promise was not merely a tactical failure. It was the foundation on which the entire decision tree of the German leadership for the Sixth Army rested. Remove that foundation, and the logic collapses instantly. Without the airlift promise, holding the pocket has no justification. Without holding the pocket, the Sixth Army withdraws in late November, battered but intact. Wintergewitter becomes unnecessary. Donnerschlag becomes unnecessary. The 30-kilometer fuel report is never written. The counterfactual is not certainty. Had the airlift actually delivered, not at 1/6 capacity, but at full capacity, the fuel situation inside the pocket would have been different. Whether different enough for Donnerschlag is impossible to say with confidence, but the possibility would have existed. In the reality of December 1942, it did not exist. Operation Wintergewitter was not a failed rescue. It was the last attempt to reverse, through operational willpower, a verdict that the arithmetic of war had already delivered in November 1942. One number echoes forward from Stalingrad, not the 300,000 encircled, not the 48 kilometers of frozen steppe, not even the 500 tons that were promised. 30 kilometers of fuel. The entire mobile capacity of a full army reduced to a distance a man can walk in a day. That number is the final receipt for a debt that was never paid. The airlift delivered a fraction of what was pledged. The deficit accumulated silently, week by week, in fuel tanks that drained faster than they filled. And when the moment came, when the relief force was close enough to see the flares, when the breakout order was finally on the table, the army that was supposed to move could not. A promise made in a briefing room, a number accepted without verification, an order to hold based on a supply line that never materialized, and 300,000 men locked into a pocket by the gap between what was said and what was real. The arithmetic had decided, long before the first shot of Wintergewitter.